The wind that moves across the southern plains of Iraq carries with it a weight that is difficult to name. It is a dry, scouring heat, smelling of ancient salt and fine, pulverized silt. Underneath the shifting dunes, the ground is not merely earth. It is a graveyard of empires, layered one on top of the other like the rings of a gargantuan, fallen tree. To stand here is to stand on the edge of a great forgetting. The modern world feels thin and fragile in this place. A mere skin of dust stretched over a skeleton of monumental stone and baked clay. If you were to dig downward, through the scorched crust and the layers of packed mud, you would eventually find the remains of cities that existed when the world was a very different shape. You would find the echoes of a time when the rivers ran in different channels and the stars overhead occupied slightly different positions in the velvet black of the night sky. In these deep layers, there are stories that refuse to fit into the narrow boxes of our modern understanding. They are stories etched into the very bones of the planet, waiting for a moment when the wind blows just right to reveal a glimpse of what came before the silence. Deep within the archives of human memory, there is a specific artifact that challenges every timeline we have ever constructed. It is a four-sided block of baked clay, inscribed with the precise, wedge-shaped marks of a language that died long before the first modern cities were even a dream. This is the Sumerian King List. It is not a book of legends or a collection of fables. To those who wrote it, it was a ledger. It was a cold, hard record of power. The scribes who pressed their styluses into this damp clay were documenting a lineage they believed to be absolute fact. But as we read the names and the durations of their reigns, the numbers begin to swell and expand until they defy the limits of human biology. We are told of kings who sat upon their thrones for 28,000 years. We are told of dynasties that lasted for centuries of centuries, stretching back into a past that our history books claim was a void of primitive hunters and unformed stone. The list speaks of a time when kingship itself descended from the heavens, manifesting in a place called Eridu, a city that the ancients believed was the first point of order in a chaotic universe. The numbers are staggering. They are not the mistakes of a tired clerk or the exaggerations of a boastful poet. They are written with a clinical, rhythmic repetition that suggests a deep, unwavering certainty. 300,000 years of continuous rule. It is a span of time so vast that it dwarfs the entirety of what we call recorded history. If these records are true, then everything we think we know about the ascent of man is merely the final, tiny chapter of a much longer and more complex saga. The Earth has a way of swallowing its secrets, burying them under miles of sediment and the relentless pressure of the ages. It erases the footprints of the past with floods, with shifting tectonic plates, and with the slow, grinding erosion of the elements. But the clay survives. The baked earth carries the message forward, speaking of a time when the world was ruled by beings whose lives were measured in epochs rather than decades. We are left to wonder if these were men at all, or if they represented something else, a different kind of existence that has since faded into the shadows of the deep horizon. To understand the scale of this mystery, we must first confront the terrifying power of geological erasure. The Earth is a restless machine, constantly recycling its own surface. Mountains are ground down into sand. Ocean floors are pushed upward to become high plateaus. In the span of a few thousand years, a thriving metropolis can be reduced to a series of subtle mounds in the desert, invisible to anyone who does not know how to look. The Sumerian heartland was once a lush, verdant paradise of marshes and winding waterways, a place where the life-giving silt of the Tigris and Euphrates created a foundation for the first great experiment in civilization. But the rivers are temperamental. Over the millennia, they have swung back and forth across the landscape, abandoning once mighty ports and leaving them stranded in a sea of parched dirt. When a river leaves a city, the city dies. The reeds wither, the brick kilns grow cold, and the wind begins its work of burial. This process of erasure is not just physical, it is structural. The deeper we go into the past, the more the evidence is crushed by the sheer weight of time. The organic materials, the wood, the leather, the woven fibers, disappear within a few human lifetimes. The metals corrode and return to the earth as unrecognizable ores. Even the hardest stones are subject to the slow bite of chemical weathering. What remains is only the most durable of artifacts: the ceramics, the heavy megaliths, and the inscriptions carved into the very skin of the world. The Sumerian King List is one of these survivors. It has endured the rise and fall of countless later cultures, the burning of libraries, and the slow drowning of cities in the rising tide of the Mesopotamian silt. It stands as a lonely sentinel, pointing back to a period that the geological record has largely scrubbed clean. When we look at the 36,000-year reign of a single monarch, we are not just looking at a number. We are looking at a gap in our knowledge that is as wide as a canyon. The investigation begins at the very beginning of the list, at the city of Eridu. Here, the text states that Alulim became king and ruled for 28,800 years. Following him, Alanger ruled for 36,000 years. These are the first entries, the foundation of the entire sovereign structure. To a modern mind, these figures are a paradox. They exist in a document that is otherwise filled with verifiable historical figures and real geographical locations. The list seamlessly transitions from these legendary, long-lived rulers into kings whose existence is confirmed by archaeological finds, such as Enmeber-Gizi of Kish. There is no break in the text, no shift in tone, and no indication that the scribe believed he was moving from myth into history. To the Sumerians, it was all one continuous thread. The paradox lies in our refusal to accept the possibility of a world that functioned on a different chronological scale. We see the numbers and we assume they are symbolic, or perhaps a mistranslation of a much smaller unit of time. We tell ourselves that these must be months, or even days, in an attempt to pull the narrative back into the realm of what we consider possible. Yet, when we apply these mathematical filters, the logic often falls apart. If we reduce the years to days, the reigns become impossibly short, lasting only a few human years for dynasties that were said to have built sprawling, complex infrastructures. If we treat them as lunar cycles, the math still fails to align with the physical reality of the cities mentioned. The skepticism of the modern historian is a necessary tool, a way to guard against the irrational. We look for the simplest explanation, that the Sumerians used these vast numbers to grant their early leaders a divine status, much like the exaggerated ages of the patriarchs in other ancient texts. It is a comforting thought. It allows us to keep our timeline intact, to maintain the belief that civilization began 6,000 years ago and has moved in a steady, upward line of progress ever since. We view the ancients as imaginative children, prone to hyperbole and the creation of grand legends to explain their humble origins. However, the rebuttal to this skepticism is found in the very soil beneath our feet. When we look at the anomalous engineering found in the oldest layers of these Mesopotamian sites, we see hints of a technical sophistication that does not match the primitive label we have assigned to that era. We find drainage systems that still function after 5 millennia, and brickwork so precise that it suggests a deep understanding of structural physics and material science. If the Sumerians were capable of such advanced planning in the things we can see, why would they be so wildly inaccurate in the things they wrote? Furthermore, geological studies of the region show evidence of catastrophic events that align with the Great Flood mentioned in the King List, a boundary marker that separates the kings of immense reigns from those with shorter, more human lifespans. Before the water came, the world was different. The environment may have been more stable, the atmospheric conditions more conducive to longevity, or perhaps the rulers themselves were part of a lineage that possessed a biology we no longer recognize. The rebuttal asks a simple, haunting question. What if the list isn't an exaggeration? What if it is a precise record of a forgotten reality that was erased by a planetary scale disaster? Moving further into the list, we encounter the city of Bad Tibera, where 3 kings ruled for a combined total of over 100,000 years. Enmenluana, Enmengalana, and Dumusid the Shepherd. The names sound like a low hum, a vibration from a distant room. Each reign is a monument of time. The paradox here deepens when we consider the logistical reality of such a rule. A king who reigns for 30,000 years is not just a leader. They are a permanent fixture of the landscape, as unchanging as a mountain or a river. Their administration would have seen entire ecosystems change. They would have watched forests grow and die, and the very stars shift their positions in the heavens. Our skepticism tells us that no biological entity could possibly endure such a span. We point to the limits of cellular decay and the inevitability of senescence. We argue that these names must represent entire dynasties or titles passed down through generations, with the collective time attributed to a single symbolic figure. But if we look closer at the Sumerian language and their systems of accounting, we find a culture that was obsessed with precision. They were the masters of the sexagesimal system, the base 60 math that we still use today to measure our time and our circles. They did not treat numbers lightly. Their records of grain shipments, land surveys, and tax levies are agonizingly detailed. For a people so grounded in the cold reality of mathematics, the sudden leap into symbolic numbers for their kings seems out of character. The rebuttal to the dynasty theory is found in the specific phrasing of the list. It does not say the house of Alulim ruled. It says Alulim ruled. It is a singular personal attribution. In the ruins of Bad Tibera, archaeologists have found traces of foundational deposits that hint at a city of immense antiquity, far older than the standard models of urban development allow. There are layers of occupation that stretch back into the mists of the early Holocene, a time when the Earth was just emerging from the last great ice age. If the kings were symbolic, why build cities that seem designed to last for an eternity? The anomalous engineering of the deep foundations suggests a vision of time that is not measured in years, but in geological epochs. The third investigation brings us to the kings of Larig and Zimbir.
Ensipacizina and enmendu durmana.
Their reigns, while slightly shorter than their predecessors, still span tens of thousands of years. The paradox here is the transition. As the list progresses toward the event of the flood, the reigns begin to decrease in a gradual, systematic way. This is not the erratic behavior of myth-making. It looks like the degradation of a system. If the numbers were purely fictional, they would likely remain consistently high until the historical period began. Instead, we see a tapering off, a slow descent into the brief lifespans we recognize today. The skepticism of the modern researcher suggests that this is a literary device, a way to bridge the gap between the divine past and the mundane present. It is a smoothing out of the narrative to make the transition more believable to the ancient audience. Yet, this skeptical view ignores the biological possibility of environmental change. We know that the Earth's magnetic field, its atmospheric pressure, and even the levels of background radiation have fluctuated wildly over the last 300,000 years. The rebuttal here looks toward the idea of a lost environment, a golden age not of magic, but of optimal biological conditions. If the planet once offered a more shielded environment, or if these early rulers utilized a form of anomalous engineering to prolong their vitality, the tapering reigns would represent the slow loss of that technology or the gradual poisoning of that environment. We see this pattern in the growth rings of ancient trees and the core samples of polar ice. The world used to be different. The air was denser, the life more robust. The King List may be recording the slow, painful adaptation of a long-lived species to a dying world. The kings were not becoming more human. The world was becoming more hostile to the giants who once walked it. The final investigation before the climax of the narrative focuses on the king known as Shuruppak and the final city before the waters rose. Here, the list reaches a fever pitch of detail. The reigns are still long, but the sense of an ending is palpable. The paradox is that Shuruppak is both a king and a city, a name that echoes through later Mesopotamian literature as a source of wisdom and a warning. The skepticism arises from the flood itself. For decades, historians treated the Sumerian flood as a purely mythological event, a cousin to the biblical story of Noah. They argued it was a metaphor for the unpredictability of the Tigris and Euphrates. But the rebuttal came from the silt itself. In the mid-20th century, excavations at sites like Ur and Kish revealed a massive, clean layer of water-laid clay, several meters thick, that sat directly on top of the oldest ruins. Above this layer, the civilization was different. The pottery had changed, the writing had evolved, and the kingly reigns had plummeted into the hundreds of years. The flood was a real physical boundary. It was a planetary reset button that buried the world of the 30,000-year kings under a mountain of mud. This leads us to the unifying theory, the moment where the disparate threads of clay, silt, and deep time pull together into a single, chilling picture. We are not the first advanced civilization to inhabit this planet. We are merely the latest. The Sumerian King List is not a book of legends. It is a survivor's report from a pre-cataclysmic world. The kingship that descended from heaven refers to a period of anomalous engineering and planetary management that operated on a scale we can barely imagine. These rulers were the stewards of a global system that predated the last ice age, a system that was shattered by a celestial or geological event of such magnitude that it washed away the infrastructure of the entire world. The long reigns were not a result of magic, but of a sophisticated understanding of biology and environment that we have yet to rediscover. When the flood came, it didn't just drown people. It drowned the knowledge of how to live forever. It broke the connection to the deep horizon, leaving the survivors to scavenge among the ruins of their own history. We are the children of the aftermath, living in the shadow of a 300,000-year empire that the Earth has tried its best to hide. The modern relevance of this discovery is not found in the dates or the names, but in the realization of our own transience. We look at our glass towers and our digital networks and we feel a sense of permanence. We believe that we have conquered time, but the Sumerian King List serves as a silent reminder that the Earth is a patient and thorough eraser. If a civilization that lasted for 300,000 years can be reduced to a few scraps of baked clay and some mounds of desert dust, then what will remain of us in the deep future? We are currently living through a period of immense stability, a brief window of calm in the chaotic history of the planet. We have forgotten the weight of deep time because we have not yet felt the crushing pressure of a planetary reset. The King List is a map of what happens when the window closes. It is a testament to the fact that power, no matter how long-lived, is ultimately a guest of the Earth, and the Earth eventually asks its guests to leave. As we stand on the edge of the southern plains, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the long shadows of the ruins seem to reach out toward us. The silence of the desert is not empty. It is full of the echoes of those 300,000 years. The mystery of the Sumerian kings is not a puzzle to be solved, but a truth to be felt. It is the realization that we are part of a much larger story, a narrative that stretches back into the darkness of a forgotten antiquity and forward into an unknown future. The earth will continue to turn, the rivers will continue to shift, and the dust will continue to settle over everything we build. But as long as we keep digging, as long as we keep listening to the whispers in the clay, we can catch a glimpse of the majesty that once was. We can remember that once, a very long time ago, kingship descended from the heavens and the world was a place of endless horizons. If you find yourself drawn to the deep mysteries of our forgotten past, If you feel the pull of the silence that lies beneath the sand, consider joining us as we continue to uncover the hidden chapters of our world. There is so much more left to find in the layers of the earth. Subscribe to the Forgotten Earth and walk with us through the shadows of time. The silence of Eridu is not the silence of a modern wasteland. It is a dense, heavy thing, a physical presence that seems to push against the skin. When you stand among the low, windswept mounds that were once the greatest temples of the ancient world, you are breathing the dust of a city that believed itself to be the center of the universe's creation. Here, the Sumerian King List begins its count. Elilim. The name is short, sharp, like the strike of a hammer on stone. To the scribes of the later dynasties, Elilim was not a ghost or a legend. He was the first anchor of order. He ruled for 28,800 years. Consider that number for a moment. It is not a rounded estimate. It is a calculation. In the Sumerian base 60 system, this number is 8 sar. A sar being a unit of 3,600. It is a clean architectural figure. If we were to map those 28 millennia onto our own understanding of time, we would have to look back to a period when the northern hemispheres were still gripped by the massive ice sheets of the late Pleistocene. While the rest of the world was supposedly struggling in small nomadic bands, the King List claims a throne was already established in the marshes of the Persian Gulf. The paradox here is one of infrastructure. A king does not rule over empty air. A reign of 28,000 years implies a society with a stability that exceeds anything we have ever witnessed. It implies a city that did not merely survive but maintained a continuous administrative identity for a duration that dwarfs the entire history of the Roman Empire, the Egyptian kingdoms, and the modern industrial age combined. We are forced to ask, what kind of structure remains standing for 28,000 years? What kind of language remains unchanged? What kind of memory does not fail? The skepticism of the modern archaeologist is a shield against the vertigo of these numbers. The standard academic response is to treat these figures as hyperdurations, intended to convey a sense of divine authority rather than literal time. It is argued that the Sumerians used these numbers as a form of sacred geometry, mapping the reigns of their kings onto the cycles of the stars. In this view, the 28,000 years of Elilim are not years at all, but degrees of a celestial rotation, a way of saying that the first king was in harmony with the cosmos. This interpretation is neat. It allows us to keep the Sumerians in their place, as a talented but ultimately primitive people who were obsessed with the sky and prone to poetic exaggeration. It keeps our timeline safe, ensuring that civilization remains a recent development that began in the Fertile Crescent around 4,000 years before the Common Era. But the rebuttal to this comfort is found in the very foundation of the Eridu temple, the Iabzu. As excavators dug through the layers of the mound, they found something that defied the standard narrative of slow, incremental progress. They found 18 distinct levels of temples, one built directly on top of the other, descending deep into the water table. At the very bottom, in the oldest layer, they did not find a primitive fire pit or a simple mud hut. They found a sophisticated, small shrine with a central altar, professional brickwork, and evidence of specialized offerings. This earliest structure dates back to a time when, according to the standard model, there should have been nothing but hunter-gatherers. The anomalous engineering of the Iabzu suggests that the kingship did not grow slowly from the soil. It arrived with a blueprint. When the list says that kingship descended from heaven, it uses the word en, which refers to the high sky or the atmosphere. It describes a transfer of organization, a sudden imposition of structure onto the chaos of the natural world. If we set aside the idea of magic and look at this through the lens of a lost, high-level management of the environment, the long reigns begin to look less like myths and more like the durations of a specific system of planetary stewardship. We see evidence in the ancient coastlines that the water levels of the Gulf were vastly different hundreds of thousands of years ago. The ruins of Eridu, which now sit miles inland, were once surrounded by a lush lagoon where the fresh water of the subterranean aquifers met the salt of the sea. This was the Abzu, the deep water, and the kings were its guardians. Their long lives may have been a byproduct of a biology tuned to a different atmospheric pressure, or perhaps a technological intervention that we can only guess at from the traces of strange alloys and glass-like residues found in the deepest strata. Moving from Eridu to the second city, Bad Tibara, the list introduces us to a world that was expanding its reach. Here, the durations remain staggering. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. The name translates roughly to the Lord, the ornament of heaven, the man of the skies. Again, we see the obsession with the celestial, but it is paired with a cold, administrative reality. Bad Tibara was a center of metalworking, its name literally meaning the wall of the metalworkers. To have a metalworking center operating for 40,000 years is a concept that breaks the mind. Our own Bronze Age lasted barely 2,000 years before it collapsed into the Iron Age. The idea of a stable, metallurgical culture lasting for 40 millennia suggests a control over resources and a social cohesion that is entirely alien to our experience of human nature, which is characterized by constant upheaval and technological obsolescence. The paradox of Bad Tibara is the paradox of the eternal city. If a city is a center of industry for 40,000 years, why is the evidence so scarce? Skeptics point to the lack of massive slag heaps or industrial waste that would surely accompany 40 millennia of smelting. They argue that the earth should be stained black with the residue of such an epoch. They claim that the absence of these markers is proof that the numbers are purely symbolic, a way of honoring the idea of the metalworker rather than the literal reality of a 40,000-year-old furnace. They see the King List as a liturgical document meant to be chanted in temples to create a sense of awe rather than a factual ledger. Yet, the rebuttal lies in the nature of the engineering itself. What if the metalworking of the antediluvian era was not the dirty, wasteful process we imagine? What if it was a form of anomalous engineering that operated on principles of molecular stability rather than crude heat? In the ruins of the region, we occasionally find artifacts that defy their context, out-of-place objects made of high-purity copper or alloys that do not corrode, even after thousands of years in the salt-heavy soil. These are the remnants of a technology that did not leave slag because it was efficient beyond our current understanding. The wall of the metalworkers may have been a site of a different kind of alchemy, a place where the very structure of matter was managed by those who lived for thousands of years. The earth does not show the scars of their industry because their industry was in harmony with the geological cycle, not in opposition to it. The list then takes us to Larag, where Ensiphedzadana ruled for 28,800 years. Larag is a city lost to the shifting sands, its exact location still a matter of debate, though its name appears in the most ancient of records. Here, the king's name means the Lord, the true shepherd of the skies. The theme of the shepherd is central to the Sumerian concept of leadership. A shepherd is not a conqueror, he is a sustainer. He protects the flock, ensures the continuity of the breed, and manages the landscape to prevent exhaustion. For 28,000 years, this shepherd maintained the equilibrium of Larag. The paradox we face here is the static perfection. In our modern world, we equate time with progress. We expect every decade to bring new inventions, new fashions, new ways of being. We cannot conceive of a society that reaches a peak and then stays there for 30,000 years. We assume that such a society would be stagnant. Our skepticism tells us that human curiosity would inevitably lead to change, to rebellion, or to collapse. We argue that the long reigns must be an error because nothing stays the same for that long. We use our own restlessness as a yardstick for the entire history of the soul. But the rebuttal to this is found in the deep biological record of the planet itself. There are species that have remained unchanged for millions of years: the shark, the dragonfly, the horseshoe crab. They achieved a perfect fit with their environment and had no need to evolve further. Is it possible that the pre-flood civilization achieved a similar static perfection? If the kings of Larig had mastered the management of the Earth's energies, the regulation of the climate, and the extension of biological life, what need would they have for the frantic progress that defines our era? Our progress is often a reaction to our fragility. We invent because we are cold, hungry, or dying. A being that rules for 28,000 years is not fragile. They would view our rapid technological cycles not as an achievement, but as a symptom of a feverish, short-lived species trying to outrun its own shadow. As we move toward the city of Zimbir, known to us as Sapar, the list introduces Enmendarana, who ruled for 21,000 years. Sapar was the city of the sun, the seat of justice, and the home of the records. It was here, according to later legends, that the knowledge of the antediluvian world was buried in stone tablets before the flood arrived. The king of Sapar was said to be a master of secrets, a man who could read the signs in the oil and the stars. The mathematics of his reign, 21,000 years, is exactly 5 5/6 of a sar. It is a precise fraction. The paradox of Sapar is the preservation of knowledge. If a civilization lasted for 300,000 years, and a single king ruled for 20,000, the sheer volume of accumulated data would be astronomical. Where are the libraries of the 300,000-year empire? Skeptics point to the lack of high-tech remains: no plastic, no glass fiber cables, no silicon chips. They argue that if such a long-lived civilization existed, they would have filled the crust of the earth with their trash. They conclude that because we find only clay and stone, the Sumerians must have been limited to clay and stone. They see the King List as a grand fiction built on a foundation of mud. The rebuttal, however, is found in the concept of deep time archiving. A civilization that plans for tens of thousands of years does not use fragile materials like plastic or silicon. They use the only thing that survives the grinding of the tectonic plates: the earth itself. They use anomalous engineering to encode information into the very structure of the landscape, into the alignment of megaliths, and into the chemical composition of baked clay. The stone tablets of Sapar were not a primitive choice. They were a deliberate one. They knew that the great erasing was coming. They knew that the rivers would move and the mountains would fall. They chose stone because they were not writing for the next generation. They were writing for the next epoch. When we look at the ruins of Sapar, we aren't looking at a failed city. We are looking at a time capsule that has been partially crushed by the weight of 5,000 feet of silt. The knowledge isn't missing. It is waiting in a language of geometry and geology that we are only just beginning to decipher. The final city of the pre-flood era is Shuruppak, where the king Ubertutu ruled for 18,600 years. This is the shortest reign of the antediluvian period, a signal that the golden age was beginning to fray at the edges. Shuruppak is a place of deep, dark earth, situated on the edge of the ancient marshes. It is here that the list reaches its breaking point. Then the flood swept over. These 5 words mark the most significant transition in human history. They represent the end of the 300,000-year rule and the beginning of the shrunken time we now inhabit. The paradox of the flood is its scale. To wash away a 300,000-year-old global infrastructure would require an event of such violence that it would leave the planet scarred for eons. Skeptics used to argue that such an event was physically impossible, that there wasn't enough water in the atmosphere to cover the mountains. They dismissed the Sumerian account as a local inundation, a particularly bad spring thaw that the survivors exaggerated into a cosmic catastrophe. They viewed the end of the kings as a simple political collapse that was later given a dramatic, watery ending by the poets. But the rebuttal has come from the ocean floors and the ice cores. We now know that at the end of the last glacial period, there were multiple meltwater pulses, sudden, catastrophic rises in sea level caused by the collapse of massive ice dams. These pulses would have sent walls of water hundreds of feet high racing across the low-lying plains of the world. For a civilization like the Sumerians, whose cities were built in the fertile deltas, this was not just a flood. It was the end of the world. The silt layers found at Shuruppak, and Kish are not the result of a local river overflowing. They are the sediment of a planetary reset. When the water receded, the landscape was unrecognizable. The aquifers were contaminated, the coastlines had moved hundreds of miles, and the climate had shifted permanently. The kingship that descended from heaven was severed from its foundations. The world that emerged from the silt was a world of broken time. The king list continues after the flood, but the numbers change instantly. The first king of Kish after the flood, Engushur, ruled for only 1,200 years. Compared to the 28,000 years of Alulim, this is a pittance. From there, the reigns continue to drop, 900 years, 600 years, until finally reaching the normal human spans of 60 or 80 years. This degradation of longevity is a record of a species in decline. It is the story of a biological inheritance being washed away by a hostile new environment. The ancient kings were not myths. They were the last of the giants, the final remnants of a lineage that knew how to live in harmony with the deep horizon. As we look at the transition from Shuruppak to Kish, we are looking at the birth of the modern world, a world defined by its brevity. We are the survivors of the survivor. We have built our cities on the mud that buried the 300,000-year empire. We walk over their streets every day, unaware that the very dust we kick up was once part of a structure that stood for longer than we have had the written word. The truth they tried to hide is not a conspiracy of men, but a conspiracy of time. The earth hides its past because it is a living, breathing entity that constantly renews itself. But the king list remains, a stubborn piece of baked clay that refuses to let the memory of the giants die. It tells us that we are not the masters of time, but its subjects. And as the wind blows through the ruins of Shuruppak, carrying the scent of salt and ancient rain, we are reminded that the deep horizon is always there, waiting for the next reset, the next erasing, and the next chapter of the forgotten earth. The weight of the numbers begins to press against the mind like the heavy atmosphere of a storm about to break. To speak of 60 years is to speak of a human life in its twilight. To speak of 600 years is to speak of the entire rise and fall of what we call modern civilization. But the Sumerians did not stop there. They built their world upon the number 60, a mathematical heartbeat that still pulses in the way we track the seconds of our lives and the degrees of our circles. This system, the sexagesimal, is the silent ghost in our machines, a legacy of a time when the measurement of reality was handled with a precision that borders on the uncanny. When we look at the king list, we are not just looking at names. We are looking at a mathematical grid draped over the chaotic surface of history. The kings ruled in units of Sar, 3,600 years, and 600 years. These are not the rounded, sloppy guesses of a primitive tribe. They are the clean, sharp divisions of a mind that understood the clockwork of the universe. As we sit in the cooling shadows of a modern evening, it is easy to forget that the very way we perceive time was handed down to us by people who claim their kings lived for 30,000 years. The paradox of the Sumerian math is that it is too perfect for the world it supposedly inhabited. Skeptics argue that the base 60 system was chosen simply because it is easily divisible by many factors: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It makes for easy accounting in a marketplace for dividing grain and land. They say the vast reigns of the kings are merely these mathematical units run amok, a numerical obsession that spilled over into their mythology. In this view, the 36,000-year reign is just a big number used to signify a very long time, much like we might use the word zillion today. But the rebuttal is found in the stars. When we apply the Sumerian mathematical constants to the slow, wobbling rotation of the Earth's axis, a phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes, the numbers align with terrifying accuracy. The precession takes approximately 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. This is a cycle so slow that it takes 72 years for the stars to shift by a single degree against the horizon. To notice this, a civilization would need to keep meticulous records for centuries, if not millennia. Yet, the Sumerian King List and its associated texts are saturated with numbers that are direct multiples and divisors of this precessional constant. If these were just simple farmers who happen to like the number 60, why does their chronological ledger synchronize so perfectly with the deep orbital mechanics of the planet? The anomalous engineering here is not in the stone, but in the logic. They were not counting sheep. They were counting the heartbeat of the earth. Consider the texture of a scribe's life in the city of Ison, roughly 4,000 years ago. The air is thick with the smell of drying mud and the sharp, alkaline tang of the river. He sits in a small courtyard, his fingers stained gray by the wet clay he handles. He is copying a text that was already ancient in his day. As his reed stylus bites into the damp surface, he is not inventing stories. He is performing an act of preservation. He feels the weight of the 300,000 years behind him. To him, the kings of the deep past are as real as the heat of the sun on his neck. He does not question why Alulim ruled for 8 Sar. He simply records it because to change the number would be to break the resonance of the world. He knows that his own life is short, a flickering candle in a dark hallway, but he believes he is part of a lineage that once stretched into the infinite. This brings us to the unifying theory, the moment where the silence of the soil and the noise of the numbers converge. We must move away from the idea that these kings were merely individual humans who somehow defied biology. Instead, we must look at the possibility that the King List is a record of a global biological technical interface. Imagine a world where the cities were not just clusters of houses, but massive, grounded components of an anomalous engineering project designed to stabilize the planetary environment. Each king represented a phase of this system, a period where the Earth's resonance was held in a specific harmonic. In this model, the long lives of the rulers were a byproduct of a tuned atmosphere. When the King List says that kingship descended from heaven, it is describing the arrival of a blueprint that synchronized human biology with the geological and celestial cycles of the planet. The cities of Eridu, Bad Tibera, and Larag were the nodes of this grid. They were built over subterranean aquifers and geological fault lines, utilizing the Earth's own internal energy to maintain a state of biological stasis. This is why the rains were so consistent and why they were measured in the units of the stars. The kings were the operators of a world machine. Their longevity was not a gift, but a function of their position within the structure. This theory explains the Great Flood not as a random weather event, but as the catastrophic failure of this global system. Perhaps the Earth's own tectonic pressures reached a breaking point, or an external celestial force disrupted the harmonic balance. When the grid broke, the water rose, and the kingship, the technical mastery of the environment, was washed away. The aftermath was a world in freefall. Without the stabilizing influence of the antediluvian cities, human biology was suddenly exposed to the raw, unshielded radiation of the sun and the fluctuating pressures of a destabilized atmosphere. This is the effect of half-life we see in the post-flood records. The reigns drop from 30,000 years to 1200, then to 900, then to 600. It is the record of a species losing its connection to a life support system. We are the descendants of those who survived the crash. Our short lives, our diseases, and our rapid aging are the scars of a planetary disaster that we have forgotten. We look at a king who ruled for 28,000 years and we call it a myth because we cannot imagine what it is like to live in a world that is not broken. The ruins of these cities still hum with a faint, residual energy. If you walk through the dust of Shuruppak at twilight, when the wind dies down and the heat of the day begins to radiate back from the ground, you can almost feel the vibration of the old foundations. The anomalous engineering of the Sumerians was not meant to be understood by the mind alone. It was meant to be felt by the body. They worked with the ME, the divine decrees or technical programs that governed everything from the making of bread to the movement of the planets. These ME were the software of their civilization, and the King List was the logbook of its execution. When we find only clay and stone, it is because we are looking at the hardware of a computer that has been unplugged for 5,000 years. The power is gone, but the architecture remains, a silent witness to a time when man was more than a scavenger of his own history. What is the modern relevance of this deep time mystery? We live in an era of the great forgetting. We have convinced ourselves that we are the first to reach the summit of knowledge, that our technology is the pinnacle of what is possible. But the Sumerian King List stands as a warning against such arrogance. It reminds us that civilization is a fragile thing, a thin layer of order that can be stripped away in a single night of water and fire. It suggests that our current stability is an anomaly, a brief lull in the long, violent history of a planet that is constantly trying to reset itself. If we are indeed living in the wreckage of a 300,000-year empire, then our current progress is merely a slow, painful rediscovery of things we once knew by heart. We are currently building a world that is once again becoming a global grid. Our satellites, our fiber optic cables, and our digital networks are a crude, electronic version of the resonance grid that once connected Eridu to Sapar. We are attempting to recreate the kingship through silicon and light, but we lack the deep time perspective of the ancients. We build for the next quarter, for the next decade, for the next generation. We do not build for the next Tsar. We have lost the ability to think in epochs. The King List challenges us to look beyond our own brief lives and to see ourselves as part of a much longer chain of sovereignty. It asks us to consider what we are leaving behind in the silt for the next civilization to find. As the narration winds down, let the image of the clay prism remain in your mind. It is a small object, no larger than a man's forearm, yet it contains the weight of 300 millennia. It is a bridge across the abyss of the Great Flood, a message from a world where time was a vast, calm ocean rather than a rushing, destructive river. The truth they tried to hide is not found in secret chambers or hidden scrolls. It is hidden in plain sight, in the numbers we use to tell the time and the stones we use to build our walls. It is the truth that we are a species with amnesia, wandering through a graveyard of giants, trying to remember the names of the kings who once held the world in their hands. The earth will continue its slow, precessional wobble. The stars will continue to shift their positions, 1 degree every 72 years. The desert will continue to bury and reveal the bones of the cities. And the Sumerian King List will remain, a stubborn anchor in the shifting sands of human memory. It is a testament to the fact that we are never truly alone in time. We are always standing on the shoulders of the deep past, looking out toward a horizon that has seen empires rise and fall for longer than we can conceive. The silence of the ruins is not the silence of death, but the silence of waiting. Waiting for the next descent of kingship, the next harmonic, and the next chapter in the story of the forgotten earth. If you feel the resonance of these ancient truths, If you hear the echo of the deep horizon in your own life, stay with us. The journey through the layers of our world is only just beginning. There are more names to be read, more cities to be uncovered, and more mysteries to be felt in the cold, damp earth. Subscribe to The Forgotten Earth, and let us continue to dig together into the shadows of our collective soul. The physical reality of the Sumerian King List is often lost in the sheer scale of the numbers it contains. We must return to the clay itself. Imagine a small room in the back of a museum, far from the polished glass cases of the public galleries. Here, the air is still and smells of dry earth and old paper. On a padded table sits the Weld-Blundell prism. It is not a large object. It is a four-sided block of baked silt, about 8 inches tall, covered in rows of tiny, precise wedge-shaped marks. When the light hits the surface at a shallow angle, the shadows of the cuneiform script cast long, thin lines, creating a texture that feels like a topographic map of a forgotten world. This is not a work of art. It is an accounting. The hands that pressed these marks into the wet clay thousands of years ago were not the hands of a dreamer. They were the hands of a record keeper, a bureaucrat of the infinite. They were documenting a legacy that they believed was as solid as the ground beneath their feet. Every line on this prism represents a lifetime or 1,000 lifetimes. To read it is to feel the weight of deep time pressing against your chest. The script does not stutter. It does not apologize for the figures it presents. It simply states, Alulum, 28,800 years. Alanger, 36,000 years. There is a rhythmic, hypnotic quality to the repetition. It is the heartbeat of an empire that measured its pulse in millennia. If we are to take this document seriously, we must ask ourselves what it truly means to rule for 30,000 years. It is a span of time that encompasses the entirety of the last great ice age. It is a duration that allows for the slow migration of forests, the rising and falling of sea levels, and the gradual shifting of the very stars in the heavens. A king who reigns for this long is not a person in the way we understand the term. They are a constant. They are an institution of biological and administrative stability that defies every law of nature we think we know. The paradox of this stability is the central mystery of our investigation. We live in a world defined by rapid, often violent change. We build a city, and within a few hundred years, it is obsolete. We write a law, and within a generation, it is forgotten. But the King List speaks of a civilization that achieved a state of perfect, unchanging order for 300,000 years. Skeptics point to this static perfection as proof of myth-making. They argue that human nature is fundamentally restless and prone to entropy. They claim that no society could possibly remain stable for even 1,000 years, let alone 30 times that amount. For the skeptic, the Sumerian King List is a fantasy of order created by a people who lived in a chaotic and unpredictable environment. It is a dream of a world where the king never dies and the river never fails. But the rebuttal is found in the anomalous engineering buried in the deepest layers of the Mesopotamian soil. When we dig beneath the ruins of the later dynasties, we find foundations that do not match the technology of the people who lived above them. We find stones that have been cut and joined with a precision that suggests a molecular understanding of the material. We find drainage pipes made of a ceramic so hard it cannot be scratched by modern steel. These are not the works of a developing culture. They are the remnants of a completed one. If a civilization reached its technical and social peak 300,000 years ago, it would have no need for the frantic progress that characterizes our era. It would have moved into a phase of pure maintenance, a long, slow afternoon of existence where the primary goal was the preservation of the harmonic balance between the city and the planet. The long reigns of the kings were not a myth. They were the manifestation of this balance. To understand how this balance was maintained, we must look at the concept of the me. In Sumerian texts, the me are often described as divine decrees or physical objects that were essential for the functioning of civilization. There were me for kingship, me for the making of fire, me for the art of the scribe, and even me for the sounding of the drum. Modern scholars often treat these as abstract cultural concepts, but the descriptions of them are strangely tactile. The me could be carried in a bag. They could be stolen. They could be put on like a garment. They were the programs of the world. If we look at this through the lens of anomalous engineering, the me represent the technical protocols of the antediluvian grid. They were the software that governed the resonance of the cities. A king who ruled for 20,000 years was the designated operator of these me. His longevity was not a personal trait, but a function of the office. He lived within a field of resonance that slowed the process of cellular decay, a field maintained by the architectural and mathematical precision of the city itself. This is why the King List is so obsessed with the transfer of kingship from one city to another. Then Eridu fell and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibera. This was not just a political shift, it was a technical one. It was the movement of the central processing unit of the planetary grid. When a city fell, it meant its resonance had been disrupted, its me had become inactive, and the biological support for the long-lived ruler had vanished. The list is a record of the grid's migration across the landscape, trying to stay ahead of the encroaching chaos of a planet in transition. As we move deeper into the list, we encounter the city of Sippar and the reign of Enmendarana. He ruled for 21,000 years, and he is often associated with the secret knowledge of the sun. The paradox of Sippar is the sun link. How could a city be dedicated to the sun in a way that granted its ruler such incredible longevity? Skeptics argue that this is merely solar worship, a primitive attempt to gain favor from a distant celestial body. They see the rituals of Sippar as superstitious nonsense, the desperate actions of a people who did not understand the physics of the stars. Yet, the rebuttal lies in our modern understanding of solar cycles and their impact on human biology. We know that the sun's activity, its flares, its magnetic storms, and its radiation directly affects the DNA of every living thing on Earth. A civilization with anomalous engineering would not worship the sun. They would harvest it. They would build cities like Sippar as massive receivers, designed to filter and modulate solar energy to create a stable biological environment. The 21,000 years of Enmendarana was the duration of a specific solar resonance cycle, a period where the city's technical interface with the sun was at its most efficient. He was the lord of the sun because he was the technician of its energy. When we look at the ruins of Sippar today, we are looking at the scorched remains of a power plant that operated on a scale of time we can barely fathom. The final city before the flood, Shuruppak, presents the most chilling evidence of the transition. Ubertutu, the king, ruled for 18,600 years. This is a significant drop from the 40,000-year reigns of the earlier kings. The paradox here is the accelerating decay. Why did the reigns begin to shorten as the flood approached? If this were a myth, surely the reigns would stay long until the very end to maximize the drama. But the King List shows a systematic degradation. Skeptics claim this is just a literary bridge, a way for the ancient poets to transition from the big numbers to the small numbers. But the rebuttal is found in the geological record of the Younger Dryas period, a time of extreme climate instability that occurred roughly 12,000 years ago. During this era, the Earth experienced sudden, violent shifts in temperature, massive glacial melts, and atmospheric disruptions. A civilization that depended on a stable resonance grid would have felt this instability long before the final catastrophe. The shortening reigns of the kings of Shuruppak were the record of the grid failing. The software of the me was glitching as the planetary environment became increasingly chaotic. The kings were aging faster because the shield of their cities was thinning. The flood was not a surprise. It was the inevitable collapse of a system that had been under immense pressure for millennia. The 5 words, "Then the flood swept over," are the final log entry of a dying machine. The post-flood section of the King List is where the true horror of the Great Forgetting begins. When kingship was lowered from heaven for the second time, it was established in Kish. But the world was different. The atmosphere was no longer the same. The resonance of the earth had shifted. The first king of Kish and Gushur ruled for 1200 years. To us, this is an impossibility. To the survivors of the flood, it must have been a tragedy. Imagine being part of a lineage that once lived for 30,000 years, only to find yourself aging and dying in a mere 12 centuries. This is the effect of half-life, the biological record of a species being cut off from its primary energy source. The paradox of the Kish dynasty is the residual technology. The kings of Kish were still doing things that seem impossible for the Bronze Age people we are told they were. They were building massive walls, digging canal systems that covered thousands of square miles, and maintaining a complex social hierarchy. Skeptics argue that this was the birth of civilization, a slow climb out of the mud. They see the 1200-year reigns as a desperate attempt to cling to the prestige of the old ones. But the rebuttal is found in the specific technical achievements of the Kish period. We find evidence of high-heat metallurgy that should not have existed for another 3,000 years. We find mathematical texts that use complex calculus to solve problems of land area and grain distribution. This was not a new civilization. It was a salvage civilization. The kings of Kish were trying to rebuild the grid using the broken pieces of the antediluvian world. They were using anomalous engineering without the full manual. Their shorter reigns were the price they paid for living in the wreckage. They were the first generation of the broken time, the first to realize that the deep horizon was receding and that the world of the giants was gone forever. This brings us to the figure of Etna, the shepherd who went to heaven. His reign of 1500 years is unique because it mentions a specific technical mission: the quest for the plant of birth. The paradox of Etna is the biological intervention. Why would a king need a special plant to produce an heir? If he lived for 1500 years, surely he had plenty of time to build a family. Skeptics treat the story of Etna as a fairy tale about a man who wanted a son, but the rebuttal is found in the reality of genetic degradation. After the flood, the survivors were likely suffering from the effects of environmental radiation and atmospheric instability. Their fertility would have been the first thing to fail. Etna's flight to heaven on the back of an eagle was an attempt to access a high-altitude or orbital facility where the original genetic blueprints, the plant of birth, were stored. He was trying to jumpstart the biological engine of the kingship. He succeeded in securing his line, but he could not restore the 30,000-year lifespan. The eagle was a piece of anomalous engineering, a last functioning drone or transport craft from the pre-flood era, and Etna was the last man with the knowledge to operate it. The transition to the Uruk dynasty marks the final shift in the narrative. Here we meet in Merkur, the builder of Uruk, who ruled for 420 years. The paradox of Uruk is the wall and the word. In Merkur is credited with the invention of writing and the building of the first great city walls. Skeptics see this as the historical core of the King List, the point where myth finally meets reality. They argue that this is when true history begins. But the rebuttal is found in the scale of the Uruk project. The city was built with a speed and a precision that defies the primitive tools of the period. The walls were not just for defense. They were massive enclosures designed to create a microclimate, a final, desperate attempt to create a sealed environment where the old longevity might be preserved. The invention of writing was not a new discovery. It was a downgrade. Before the flood, knowledge was likely encoded in the resonance of the me. As that technology failed, the survivors had to resort to the crude method of pressing marks into clay. Writing was an admission of defeat. It was a way to store information because the human memory, once capable of holding 30,000 years of experience, was now fading after only a few centuries. Then comes Gilgamesh. His reign of 126 years is the final echo of the deep time. He is the two-thirds god, a term that refers to his genetic makeup. He was the product of a final, successful attempt to merge the old heavenly lineage with the new, earthly biology. The paradox of Gilgamesh is his restlessness. He is a king who cannot stay still. He is obsessed with fame, with walls, and with the secret of immortality. Skeptics see him as the ultimate human hero, the man who faces death and learns to accept it. But the rebuttal is found in his destination. He goes to the cedar forest to raise a name, and then he travels to the ends of the earth to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood. This was not a journey of self-discovery. It was a search for the last active node of the antediluvian grid. He was looking for the hardware. He found the plant of immortality, a chemical or biological stabilizer, but he lost it to a snake, a metaphor for the relentless, creeping entropy of the post-flood world. Gilgamesh's failure marks the end of the heroic age. After him, the numbers in the King List become normal. The connection to the deep horizon is finally and completely severed. The giants have left the building, and the era of the brief men has begun. As we look at the later dynasties of Ur, Larsa, and Isen, we see a world that has forgotten its origins. The kings still use the old titles, but they rule over a landscape of dust and salt. The canals are filling with silt, the rivers are moving away from the cities, and the Emi have become nothing more than symbols on a priest's robe. The anomalous engineering has become magic, and the kingship that once descended from heaven is now something that is fought over by petty warlords with bronze spears. The King List becomes a dry ledger of coups, assassinations, and tax records. The light of the 300,000 years has gone out, leaving only the cold, hard clay of the prism. But the unifying theory reminds us that the Emi are still there. They are built into the very geometry of the ruins. The mathematical code of 60, the precession of the equinoxes, and the resonance of the planetary grid are not lost in the sense of being gone. They are dormant. We are currently living in the interregnum, the period between the failure of the old grid and the emergence of the next one. Our modern technology, our internet, our global positioning systems, our genetic engineering is a frantic, unconscious attempt to rebuild the me using the materials of the new world. We are trying to find our way back to the 30,000-year reign, but we are doing it without a map. The truth they tried to hide is that we are not the protagonists of history. We are the scavengers of the downtime. We are living in a period of biological and social fragmentation that is the direct result of a planetary scale system's failure. The Sumerian King List is not a list of gods or myths. It is a technical manual for a world that worked. It tells us that we were once part of a system that lasted for 300,000 years, a system where time was a tool rather than a cage. When we look at the prism today, we should not feel a sense of distant curiosity. We should feel a sense of loss. We should feel the phantom limb of our own lost longevity. The modern relevance of this mystery is found in our current environmental crisis. We are once again facing a planetary reset. We are seeing the instability of the climate, the failure of our social structures, and the limits of our biological survival. We are approaching our own 5 words. The King List tells us that the Earth does not care about our progress. It cares about resonance. It cares about the me. If we do not find a way to synchronize our civilization with the deep time cycles of the planet, we will be washed away just as surely as the kings of Shuruppak. The silt is already waiting. As the wind continues to blow across the plains of Iraq, it carries the same salt and the same dust that it did in the days of Alulim. The desert is a place of absolute honesty. It does not hide the ruins. It preserves them in a layer of silence. The Sumerian King List is a voice from that silence, a rhythmic, mathematical reminder of who we were before we forgot how to listen to the earth. It is a bridge of baked clay, stretching across the abyss of the flood, waiting for someone to walk across it and reclaim the sovereignty of the deep horizon. The story of the forgotten earth is not over. It is merely waiting for the next cycle to begin. The names on the prism are not dead. They are the coordinates of a future that we have already lived. If we can learn to read the cuneiform of the stars and the geometry of the mud, we might find the key to the plant of birth. We might find the eagle that takes us back to the heaven from which kingship once descended. But until then, we must wait in the shadows of the ruins, watching the sun set over the mounds of Eridu, and remembering that once, for 300,000 years, the world was a place of endless order and the kings were as eternal as the mountains. Stay curious. Stay vigilant. The deep time is always beneath your feet, and the forgotten earth is always speaking, if only you know how to hear. Subscribe to The Forgotten Earth, and join us as we continue to dig through the layers of the past to find the truth about our future. The journey is long, the silt is deep, but the horizon is always there, waiting to be claimed once more. The arithmetic of the kings is a geometry of the soul, a system of accounting that treats the passage of time not as a linear march toward a destination, but as a vast, repeating spiral. To understand the 300,000 years of rule, one must first surrender the modern concept of the clock. We are used to seconds that tick with the mechanical coldness of vibrating quartz, but the Sumerians measured time by the breath of the planet and the slow, heavy wobbling of the Earth's axis. This is the secret held within the sexagesimal system, a mathematical language that uses the number 60 as its heartbeat. When we look at the King List through this lens, we realize that the durations of the reigns, 18,000, 28,000, 36,000 years, are not random inflations of ego. They are the numerical signatures of the precession of the equinoxes. The precession is a slow, rhythmic movement of the Earth's celestial poles, a wobble that takes 25,920 years to complete a single cycle. It is a measurement that requires a vantage point of centuries to even notice, yet the Sumerian numbers are fractal reflections of this cosmic duration. For a civilization to bake these numbers into their sovereign records, they would need a continuity of observation that spans not just generations but epochs. This is the paradox of the ancient astronomer. How could a people who supposedly lived in mud-brick huts and used stone tools possess a calculus of the stars that matches the precision of modern satellite telemetry? Skeptics argue that this is a case of mathematical pareidolia, that we are seeing patterns where none exist, projecting our own understanding of physics onto a collection of lucky guesses. They claim the number 60 was chosen because it was easy for trade, and any alignment with the celestial cycles is a mere statistical coincidence. But the rebuttal is etched into the very stones of the ruins. When we examine the orientation of the earliest temples at Eridu and Uruk, we find that they are not aligned to the simple cardinal directions of north and south. They are aligned to the heliacal rising of specific stars as they appeared tens of thousands of years ago. To build a temple in this way is to perform an act of anomalous engineering. It is to anchor a physical structure to a specific moment in the precessional cycle. The kings were not just leaders of men. They were the keepers of the celestial clock. Their long reigns represented the periods in which the Earth's orientation allowed for a specific kind of resonance between the city and the sky. The numbers on the King List are the timestamps of these resonant windows. They are a record of a world that was synchronized with the heavens in a way we can no longer feel. Imagine the city of Eridu at the height of its power, 60,000 years before the first pharaoh of Egypt was born. The city is not a collection of buildings, but a single integrated machine made of basalt, bitumen, and sun-dried clay. It sits on the edge of the Abzu, the subterranean sea of fresh water that the Sumerians believed was the source of all life. This was not a primitive well, but a massive, engineered aquifer system that utilized the Earth's own thermal energy to power the city's metabolism. The ziggurat at the center of Eridu was the interface, a tiered mountain of stone designed to act as a biological technical resonator. The king, sitting at the summit of this structure, was part of the circuit. His body, tuned by the anomalous engineering of the temple's internal chambers, became a conduit for the planetary frequency. This is why he lived for 28,000 years. He was not a biological anomaly. He was a component in a long-duration life support system. The sensory reality of this era would be unrecognizable to us. The air was denser, saturated with the moisture of the vast Mesopotamian marshes and the ozone of a more active planetary magnetic field. The sound of the city was a low, constant hum, the vibration of the water moving through the deep channels of the Abzu and the resonance of the temple's massive foundations. It was a world of slow movements and deep stability. The kings of the pre-flood era did not build for their children. They built for the stars. They watched the slow drift of the constellations, knowing that their reign would last as long as the star of their city remained in its celestial house. They were the stewards of a 300,000-year stability, a period of planetary management that allowed the Earth to heal from previous cataclysms and flourish into a garden of anomalous perfection. This brings us to the terrifying reality of geological erasure. We must ask ourselves why a civilization that lasted for 300,000 years left so little for us to find. The answer lies in the relentless chemistry of the Earth's crust. If you were to take a modern city, New York, London, or Tokyo, and abandon it for just 10,000 years, it would be virtually invisible. The steel would corrode into a fine dust, the glass would shatter and be buried under layers of silt, and the concrete would crumble back into sand. Now, imagine a span of time 30 times longer than that. Imagine the weight of 300,000 years of dust, flood sediment, and tectonic shifting. The Earth does not just bury the past, it digests it. It grinds the achievements of the ancients into the raw materials of the future. The Sumerian King List is a survivor because it was written on the only medium that the Earth cannot easily destroy: baked earth. Clay is the memory of the planet. The paradox of the missing machines is the most common weapon used by skeptics to dismiss the antediluvian empire. They ask, where are the gears? Where are the wires? Where are the silicon chips of this advanced society? They assume that any advanced civilization must follow the same path of messy, wasteful industrialization that we have followed. But this is the arrogance of the brief man. The kings of the deep past did not use electricity. They used resonance. They did not use plastic. They used restructured stone. Their technology was an extension of natural laws that we have not yet rediscovered, a form of engineering that operated in harmony with the Earth's own vibrations. When their cities fell, their machines did not rust. They simply became part of the landscape again. A ziggurat is not just a pile of bricks. It is a decommissioned engine, its internal chambers now filled with the silt of the Great Erasing. The investigation into the King List must eventually confront the Great Year, the larger precessional cycle of 12 periods, each lasting 2,160 years. This number, 2,160, is the foundational unit of the Sumerian sovereign math. It is the duration of one age, the age of Taurus, the age of Aries, the age of Pisces. The King List organizes its reigns in multiples of these ages. When a king rules for 36,000 years, he is ruling for 16 complete precessional ages. This is not a human lifespan, it is a celestial appointment. The paradox is that the Sumerians knew these numbers long before they had any right to. Skeptics claim they simply enjoyed the symmetry of the math and built a mythology around it. However, the rebuttal comes from the biological evidence hidden in our own DNA. Geneticists have discovered that human populations underwent a massive bottleneck event tens of thousands of years ago, a moment when our numbers were reduced to a tiny fraction of what they had been. This bottleneck corresponds with the periods of intense environmental instability recorded in the later parts of the King List. We are the descendants of the survivors who huddled in the ruins of the antediluvian grid, watching as the kingship was taken from city to city, trying to find a place where the old resonance still worked. The degradation of the reigns from 30,000 years down to a few hundred is the mathematical record of this genetic and environmental collapse. We are the echoes of a fading frequency. As we move toward the final climax of our journey through the forgotten Earth, we must look at the unifying theory that ties the clay prisms to the modern stars. We are living in a period of amnesia, a brief gap in the long-form history of our species. The 300,000 years of the Sumerian kings represent the norm, while our current 6,000 years of recorded history represent the exception. We are the outlier. We have built a civilization on the scrap heap of a much larger and more sophisticated world system. The anomalous engineering of the ancients was designed to prevent the very things we are currently experiencing: climate instability, biological decay, and social fragmentation. They knew that the Earth is a temperamental host, and they used their kingship to keep the host calm. The climax of the narrative is the realization that the flood was not just a natural disaster, but a systemic failure. The Great Reset was the moment the planetary grid could no longer hold back the pressures of the solar and tectonic cycles. When the water swept over, it wasn't just clearing the land, it was clearing the frequency. The post-flood kings were not starting a new world. They were trying to restart a stalled engine. This is why the early dynasties of Kish and Uruk were obsessed with building walls and digging canals. They were trying to create a localized resonance, a small, shielded bubble of order in a world that had become chaotic and hostile. They were the technicians of the aftermath, trying to read the blueprints of heaven with eyes that were already beginning to fail. The so what of this story, the modern relevance that we must carry with us, is a sense of profound humility. We look at our digital world and we feel a sense of permanence, but the King List tells us that permanence is a myth. The only thing that lasts is the Earth and the records we entrust to it. We are currently approaching a moment of planetary transition that the ancients would have recognized immediately. We are feeling the tremors of a shifting horizon, the breakdown of our own systems of order. The Sumerian King List is not a curiosity of the past. It is a mirror of the future. It warns us that when the next great erasing comes, our glass and our steel will not save us. Only the things we have written in the clay of our collective soul will remain. The philosophical outro of our journey is a reflection on the nature of sovereignty. What does it mean to rule? To the ancients, it was the heavy responsibility of maintaining the link between the deep past and the distant future. It was the task of standing at the center of the resonance and holding the world together through the sheer force of mathematical and biological will. We have abandoned this kind of sovereignty in favor of a short-term, predatory relationship with our planet. We have forgotten that we are the stewards of the deep horizon. The kings of Sumer, with their 30,000-year reigns, are calling out to us across the abyss of the flood, asking us to remember our place in the cosmic ledger. As the shadows grow long over the mounds of Iraq, and the stars begin to flicker to life in the desert sky, we are reminded that the story of the forgotten Earth is still being written. We are the current scribes, the ones who must decide what is worth preserving. Will we be a footnote in a future king list, a brief, chaotic reign of a few decades? Or will we find a way to reconnect with the sovereignty of the deep past? The answer lies in the dust beneath our feet and the numbers in our blood. The silence of the ruins is not an end. It is a pause, a breath taken by the planet before the next cycle begins. If you have felt the weight of the deep time during this journey, if you have heard the hum of the anomalous engineering in the descriptions of the ancient cities, then you are already part of the search. The mystery of the Sumerian kings is a call to awaken from our amnesia and to see the world for what it truly is: a layered, ancient, and deeply intelligent organism that remembers everything we have forgotten. Stay with us as we continue to peel back the layers of the silt. Subscribe to The Forgotten Earth and walk with us through the ruins of the 300,000-year empire. The clay is waiting. The stars are moving. The deep horizon is calling us home. To look upon the language of the Sumerians is to look upon a series of footprints left by a traveler who walked through a world we can no longer see. The cuneiform script, with its aggressive wedges and intersecting lines, is often described by linguists as a language isolate. It has no known relatives. It did not evolve from the surrounding dialects of the Semitic or Indo-European families. It appeared, much like the kingship itself, as a fully formed system of immense complexity. When we run our fingers over the textured surface of a tablet from the era of Shuruppak, we are touching a code that was designed to be immutable. Modern scholars view these marks as symbols for sounds and trade goods, but the unifying theory of the Forgotten Earth suggests a different purpose. These were not just words, they were geometric blueprints. Each sign was a configuration of frequency, a specific arrangement of angles designed to trigger a resonance in the physical world. This was the me in its written form, the source code of a civilization that understood the relationship between symbol, sound, and matter. The paradox of the Sumerian language is its technical precision. In our modern languages, words are fluid. They change meaning over centuries. They drift and soften. But the Sumerian technical terms for engineering, astronomy, and mathematics remained locked in place for thousands of years. Skeptics argue that this stability was simply the result of a conservative priestly class that refused to innovate. They see the rigid nature of the script as a sign of a stagnant culture that valued tradition over progress. They claim the complexity of the language was a barrier to entry, a way for the elite to maintain control over the primitive masses by hoarding the secrets of literacy. But the rebuttal is found in the physical impact of the spoken word. The Sumerian texts are filled with references to incantations that could bind the wind or purify the water. In a world governed by anomalous engineering, an incantation was not a magic spell. It was a vocalized frequency. If the cities were built as resonant chambers, then the language was the key that turned the engine. The kings, who lived for tens of thousands of years, were the master operators of this vocal technology. They knew how to modulate their voices to interact with the standing waves of the ziggurats. This is why the King List is so specific about the descent of kingship. It was the delivery of a linguistic and mathematical frequency that allowed human society to synchronize with the planetary pulse. When we see the wedge-shaped marks on the clay today, we are looking at the remnants of a sonic control system that the Earth has since silenced. As we move deeper into the final layers of this mystery, we must confront the biological reality of the plant of birth and the plant of heart mentioned in the ancient records. These were not mere herbs or flowers. They were the biological components of the antediluvian life support system. In the King List, the transition from the 30,000-year reigns to the 1,200-year reigns is not just a chronological shift. It is a record of biological starvation. The kingship included the stewardship of a specific genetic archive, a collection of biological me that allowed for the indefinite repair of cellular tissue. This is the anomalous engineering of the genome. The kings were the guardians of a lineage that had bypassed the natural limits of senescence. The paradox of the eternal bloodline is the central theme of the post-flood struggle. Why did Gilgamesh travel to the ends of the earth to find a single plant? Why did Etna risk a flight into the high atmosphere to secure a biological catalyst? Skeptics argue that these stories are universal metaphors for the human fear of death, simple allegories for the transition from a mythological age to a historical one. They claim that the ancients invented these plants to explain why their ancestors lived so much longer than they did, creating a narrative of loss to justify their own brevity. But the rebuttal lies in the biological bottleneck that exists in the heart of every modern human. Our DNA carries the scars of a massive collapse, a moment in the deep past where our complexity was suddenly and violently reduced. The Great Flood was not just a deluge of water. It was a deluge of radiation and environmental toxicity that shattered the delicate resonance of the antediluvian genome. The plants were the stabilizers, the tools of anomalous engineering that kept the human form in its optimal state. When the grid failed, the stabilizers were lost. The kings who followed the flood were like men trying to run a high-performance machine on low-grade fuel. Their 1,200-year reigns were the final, sputtering gasps of a biological inheritance that was being reclaimed by the Earth. We are the result of that reclamation, a species that has been trimmed by the forces of entropy until we fit into the narrow window of a 70-year life. This leads us to the final meditation on the Great Year and the cyclical nature of the forgotten Earth. We are currently living in the tail end of a precessional age, a period that the ancients would have recognized as a time of profound transition. The Sumerian King List is not a closed book. It is a cycle that is beginning to reset. The kingship did not just descend once. It is a recurring phenomenon, a periodic resynchronization of the planet. We see the shadows of this reset in our modern obsession with artificial intelligence, genetic editing, and planetary engineering. We are unconsciously trying to rebuild the me. We are attempting to recreate the resonant cities and the eternal bloodlines using the crude tools of our current epoch. The paradox of our modern progress is that it is a frantic repetition of a history we have forgotten. We believe we are moving forward into an unknown future, but the King List suggests we are merely returning to the beginning of a 300,000-year spiral. Skeptics of this cyclical view argue that history is linear, a one-way journey from the primitive to the sophisticated. They point to our computers and our spacecraft as proof that we have surpassed anything the ancients could have imagined. They see the King List as a dead relic of a world that was smaller, darker, and more limited than our own. But the rebuttal is found in the deep time perspective. If we look at the Earth not as a resource to be consumed, but as a machine to be managed, our modern technology looks like a temporary glitch. We build for obsolescence. The Sumerian kings built for the precessional wobble. We measure our success in quarterly profits. They measured theirs in SAR. The truth they tried to hide is that our current way of life is an unstable vibration, a frequency that cannot be sustained by the planet for more than a few centuries. The Earth is a patient host, but it eventually ejects any guest that does not respect its resonance. The 30,000-year kings were the perfect guests. They understood the rhythm of the deep horizon, and they adjusted their lives to match it. The modern relevance of this realization is a call to biological sovereignty. We must ask ourselves if we are willing to continue as the scavengers of the downtime, or if we are ready to reclaim the technical and spiritual legacy of the deep past. The ruins of Eridu and Shuruppak are not just graveyards. They are laboratories. They are the sites where the laws of anomalous engineering are still written in the geometry of the foundations. The King List is the syllabus for a school of time that we have yet to attend. It tells us that our brevity is not a biological necessity, but a technical failure. It reminds us that we were once the masters of the me, the operators of the planetary grid. As the wind scours the plains of Iraq, turning the baked clay of the ruins back into the dust of the desert, we are left with a final choice. We can view the Sumerian King List as a collection of impossible numbers and dusty names, or we can see it as the skeletal remains of our own lost potential. The 300,000 years are not behind us. They are beneath us, supporting the thin layer of our current reality. The Great Erasing is a process that is always happening, a slow grinding of the gears of time that turns everything into silt. But the information remains. The resonance persists. The philosophical outro of our journey is the recognition that the forgotten Earth is only forgotten because we have chosen to close our eyes to the scale of our own story. We have traded the deep horizon for the immediate flicker of the screen. We have exchanged the sovereignty of the stars for the convenience of the moment. But the clay does not forget. The math does not lie. The kings who ruled for eons are still there, etched into the baked earth, waiting for a generation that is brave enough to look at the numbers and see the truth. The silence of the desert is the silence of a library that no one visits. It is full of the voices of the 30,000-year kings, whispering the secrets of the me to the wind. If you listen closely, you can hear the hum of the Abzu, the vibration of the old foundations, and the rhythm of the celestial clock. You can feel the weight of the 300 millennia, not as a burden, but as a foundation. We are the children of the giants, and it is time for us to remember how to walk in their footsteps. Join us as we continue to listen to the whispers of the silt. Subscribe to The Forgotten Earth, and let us dig together into the deep layers of the past to find the frequency of our future. The journey through the 300,000 years is not an end, but a beginning, a return to the kingship that once descended from heaven and is waiting to descend once more. The horizon is wide, the time is deep, and the earth is ready to reveal its secrets to those who have the patience to hear. The sun sets over the ruins of Zimbir, and for a moment, the shadows of the broken walls look like the long, thin wedges of the cuneiform script. The landscape itself is a tablet, and we are the ones who must learn to read it again. The sovereignty of the deep horizon is not a gift from the past. It is a responsibility for the future. We are the keepers of the list. We are the operators of the memory. And as the stars begin their slow, 72-year shift of a single degree, we are reminded that in the eyes of the planet, we have only just arrived.